The flop press is one of the most interesting moves in arm wrestling, but it certainly is not a fundamentally correct technique. This is because you are giving away your wrist flexion intentionally, meaning you are already surrendering one of the most important strengths in arm wrestling immediately off the go. Most people would consider the flop press to be a secondary option if you are unable to force the match into a hook. Instead of gaining access to your arm power by bending your wrist, you can actually gain access to your arm power by flopping your wrist. The most famous flop wrist presser in arm wrestling is easily Jerry Cadorette. He is the only top 10 puller at the moment whose primary weapon is the flop press. Now, most people would think of Jerry as an inside arm wrestler. Jerry would love for the match to go in a hook, but unfortunately his wrist is not quite strong enough to accomplish this. However, I would argue the case that Jerry's flop press is potentially better than his hook. But how could this be? How could you have more power without your wrist than with your wrist? Well, this is because Jerry Cadorette is a top roller. Let me explain. You may have heard Devin Larratt talk about the arm wrestling spectrum. The arm wrestling spectrum covers all the techniques from inside to outside arm wrestling. Inside arm wrestling is all about the arm and the shoulder, and outside arm wrestling is all about the hand. The concept is that there aren't just a set number of techniques. For example, a hook and a top roll. You could be in a hook, a top roll, or anything in between. You could be in a position where you are 30% outside and 70% inside, or 50% outside, 50% inside, etc. Traditionally, the King's move would be considered 100% outside, meaning you've entirely given away your arm and shoulder and you only care about attacking the hand. And the flop press would be considered 100% inside, meaning you've entirely given away your hand and you only care about attacking the arm and shoulder. But this is where I start to disagree. Of course, every flop presser has a slightly different technique, but I would argue that in general, the flop press is not a 100% inside move, and this is because of pronation. It may look like Jerry is simply driving sideways with everything he's got, and that is all there is to it. But Jerry's flop press also incorporates a ton of pronation. To see this in action, let's take a look at a classic match between John Brzenk and Jerry Cadorette. Round 2 of this match begins just as you would expect. Jerry dumps his wrist and hits his press, and John takes full hand control. But as the match goes on, something very interesting happens. Even though he's pressing, Jerry begins to chip away at the wrist of John Brzenk. Eventually, Jerry actually cracks John's wrist back, and he defeats John in something that is in between a press and a top roll. I like to refer to this move as a flop roll. So even though Jerry is pressing and he is surrendering his wrist flexion, he is not surrendering his pronation. We saw a similar example of this in John Brzenk's match with Irakli Zarakishvili. John Brzenk was able to take the wrist of Irakli and secure full hand control. It may appear as though the only thing Irakli has left is his shoulder commitment, but again, this is actually not the case. Irakli still has some access to his pronation, and we see this as soon as John Brzenk tries to transition to a press. As John transitions, Irakli is able to keep John's wrist flat, even though he had full hand control moments prior. This is because Irakli is still keeping his thumb-based pronation through his flop press. So even though Irakli is pressing, he is still somewhat in an outside move. Now let's take a look at Jerry Cadorette versus Dave Chafee. Finally, Jerry is going up against someone who will just hook him so that he can access his power, right? Even though Dave is willing to go inside with Jerry, we still see Jerry attempting to flop his wrist in order to run away from the hook. People often think of an open top roll or a King's move as a way to run away from someone's power. But as we can see here, the flop press can also be a way to run away from someone's power. In a top roll, you're running by going over the top or around the side. But with a flop press, you can run from someone's power by going somewhat underneath. Sometimes Jerry's wrist is not taken from him, but he gives it away on purpose. This allows him to maintain his thumb-based pronation while committing his shoulder at the same time. And by flopping his wrist back, he can even over-pronate his opponent, which puts them in an awkward position. Another great example of this technique is in the Hermes versus Levon match. We see that Levon hits outside and takes the wrist of Hermes, but Hermes is still able to maintain his pronation at least a bit even after switching to the flop press. Hermes is pressing, but we can still see that the pressure is primarily going through Hermes' thumb into Levon's hand. Every time Hermes drives to the side, we can see his hand and wrist pronate just a little bit. This is one of the reasons Levon had so much trouble finishing the match. He just couldn't quite control Hermes' pronator. If Levon had attempted to stand up and press, he may have lost his own wrist like we saw earlier. So of course, Hermes has a ton of side pressure and elbow flexor in order to stop Levon like this, but thumb-based pronation is also an integral part of this move. So what does all this mean? If we take a look back at the spectrum of arm wrestling, I think there is a slight change that could be made. Firstly, I think it might make more sense to make it a circle. Secondly, I would change the furthest inside move to a traditional press, and then I would put the flop press in between the king's move and the traditional press. This would mean that the flop press is somewhere around a 50% inside move and a 50% outside move when performed correctly, as pronation is a very important part of this move. This also leads into the obvious question, how would Jerry do against Levon? Does Jerry have the perfect move to go around Levon's power while still accessing his own? Now at the moment, it sounds like Levon has sustained a pretty serious injury, so unfortunately it doesn't look like Levon will be pulling anyone anytime soon. But hoping that he recovers quickly, if we take a look at Jerry Cadorette versus Georgi Svetkov, we will see that this match looks nearly identical to the match between Hermes and Levon. Jerry is certainly very strong in these positions as he has spent pretty much his whole career in them. However, you would have to assume that Georgi is not on the same level as Levon. So if Georgi was able to get 2 wins on Jerry, it seems unlikely that Jerry could do anything to Levon. However, the style of your opponent sometimes makes a bigger difference than the strength of your opponent. Levon seems to lose a huge chunk of his power right next to the pin pad. Levon has pretty much never lost center table or hand control over the past few years, but there have been multiple times where Levon was either slowed down or even fully stopped close to the pin pad. Jerry just might have the perfect style to make this happen. So the question is, how much stronger can Jerry become compared to his level against Georgi? If Jerry actually was injured against Georgi like some have said, maybe he has a pretty decent chance of at least getting a stop. And from there, Jerry does have some of the best endurance in the world. Of course, Levon might just low grip Jerry, which would totally nullify Jerry's flop press. But if Levon falls into the trap of trying to top roll Jerry, we just might see something amazing. Maybe after all, the single greatest technique in the sport of arm wrestling is the legendary flop roll.